Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Level Up Tutorials, and in this video, we're going to get set up connecting our React app to our Graph CMS so that they're going to be able to talk via something called Apollo Provider. Now, this is going to make it so that we can consume APIs directly anywhere inside of our React code using Apollo queries. So let's get going on that right now. Okay, so in this video, we're actually going to start going over some code. We're going to get into the code here and get a real project up and running. Now, to do that, we want to do first is a create React app. Now, I love create React app. You see me use it all the time on this series. It's a great way to get started quickly with React projects. Now, one of the cool things is that if you are running a Node version 5.2 or higher, you now have access to something called npx, which allows you to run commands without ever having to install things, right? So if you have Node version 5.2 or npm version 5.2, then you should be able to use npx. The quick way to determine this is you can do npm-v, and this will tell you which version of Node you are running, or npm, I'm sorry. And now we just want to run npx. This way we don't have to install create React app on our system, and we can say create React app. Now next we want to give it the name of our application, which is just going to be something like level 1 GraphQL. Okay, and this is going to go ahead and create a new project for us. Keep in mind that you cannot use spaces or uppercase letters in your project names, and so that's why I did hyphens and lowercase there. You can name yours whatever. Again, we are building a blog, so it doesn't necessarily matter, and it's not going to be a crazy full-featured blog. The main purpose of this is more or less to get comfortable with working with Apollo as well as a GraphQL API. Now from here, I can change directories into level 1 GraphQL API, and I can run yarn start. Now, if you do not have yarn installed, you will need to have yarn installed. And I also recommend you take the level 1 React course, which is React 16 for everyone. That's going to be the basic course that shows you how to not only get up and running with Create React app, but also give you the React foundation. So if you've never worked with React in general, I highly recommend taking that course. You can see here we do have a localhost port 3000 version of our application up and running. I'm going to go ahead and open this app up in my text editor. Okay, and here we have our application up and running in VS Code. My theme that I'm using is going to be Level Up 2. It's under the Level Up official package, and the theme itself, if you want to check out the theme under color theme, is Level Up 2 Electric Boogaloo. It's a little bit better for contrast and screens. I'm hoping this is going to look a little bit better on some recordings here. Let's check it out. We have our standard stuff that you're used to seeing inside of a Create React app. By the way, this font that I'm using is called Dank Mono. I get a lot of questions about that as well. Dank Mono, it's a paid font, but it's excellent and I love it. Okay, so check it out. This is our app.js. This is what's up and running here. If you've done Create React app, you're probably bored out of your mind because this is stuff we do every time, right? Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about GraphQL now. Because what we want to do is connect our React app to our Graph CMS, and to do that, you use something called Apollo, which we've talked about. Now, Apollo is the easiest and best library in terms of all sorts of things, in my opinion, and it gives you so many things out of the box for free. All we want to do from here is go to Client and then select React plus React Native. Now, Apollo Client works for all of these different things, and so because of that, well, they have different documentations for all of them. So if you're using Angular Vue or any of these things, go ahead and follow those documentations. Okay? So check it out. Let's keep scrolling down here and let's click Get Started. We want to get started with Apollo Client in our React app. Now you might be wondering, what do we need? Well, we need something called Apollo Boost and React Apollo and GraphQL. These are all three different libraries that we want, okay? What are these three libraries doing? Well, we'll go over in a minute. Let's go ahead and just copy these three libraries. I'm going to use Yarn because the application itself is already using Yarn, so we can copy Apollo Boost, React-Apollo, and GraphQL. Now, in our command line, I'm going to go ahead and have a new tab, I'm going to make sure I'm in the same project directory. You have to be in your same project, and I'm going to do yarn, and then we're going to do add, and then we're going to have Apollo Boost, React Apollo, and GraphQL. And this should get us set up pretty quickly here. All we need to do essentially is connect to our GraphQL server with Apollo, and then connect that into our React application, okay? Now, app.js is pretty much the intro to our application. We also have this index.js where we render our app. So we're probably going to be hanging out in app.js to start, but that will most likely change, okay? And let's head back into our browser here, and let's check out the next step, because the next step in the Apollo documentation is that we need to create a client. Now, we need to create a client using something called Apollo Boost. Now, Apollo Boost is a brand new library from Apollo that makes, well, connecting to a client much easier than it's ever been, along with some sensible defaults. Okay, so let's get into it here. We're going to first import Apollo client, import Apollo client, client from, and then it's Apollo Boost. Okay, so we have the Apollo client, and next we want to actually create a client. So we can say const client is equal to, and then if we head back to their documentation, you'll be able to see we just simply need a new Apollo client with an object that accepts a URI. So we can say new Apollo client, right? And then next we have an object inside of this function. And inside of this function, we need a URI. Now, what is a URI in this particular instance? Well, this is the single endpoint to our GraphQL server. Now, again, we mentioned before with normal REST APIs, you're hitting a whole bunch of URLs all the time, right? You're hitting a whole API URL that returns an individual data. Well, with GraphQL, you hit one URL, and you hit it when you're creating your client, and it sort of always hits the same URL with different actual queries, right? So this URI is going to be the location of our GraphQL API. If you've ever seen a GraphQL API that's public, that exists, and you want to connect your app to it, all you simply need to do, import Apollo client from Apollo Boost, then create a new client, paste in that URL to the URI here, and then in a minute, we're going to wrap our application in an Apollo provider. Okay, it's going to be really slick. So let's go ahead and get that URL, because you can see we have some URL here in the docs, but that's obviously not the one we want. The URL that we're going to get is going to come from our Graph CMS. So if we click dashboard and we scroll down, you'll be able to see endpoints, okay? And we can click the URL itself to copy to our clipboard. This is going to be our GraphQL API. Now, if you were using something like Prisma, or you were using your own GraphQL, you might have a different location for that GraphQL server. For instance, the Level Up Tutorials one, the server is running on the same server as the client, and I can just say, hey, use / GraphQL as my server, right? So it's going to be a little bit different for each one you're adding, but we simply just have this endpoint, and that's all we need is to copy that and paste it in here. All right, this is what mine looks like. What this should do is it's going to create us a client now that we can use in a React component. Now, you'll remember we also installed React Apollo. So if we head back to the Apollo documentation, you're going to be able to see that we also have our Apollo provider from React Apollo. Now, Apollo provider is not the default import, so we need to import it within brackets, but we want to import Apollo provider in our application. Then we want to wrap our application in Apollo provider and have the client as the individual client prop on here, okay? Super duper easy. Let's go ahead and import Apollo, and we're going to import Apollo provider from React Apollo. It's funny, I almost always type Apollo-React. It's just some weird thing that my fingers just want to do, but it is in fact React-Apollo, okay? Now next we're going to go ahead and wrap our code in this Apollo provider. Now the Apollo provider is simply going to make sure that our entire application has access to the client, okay? Okay, so we have our Apollo provider, and to make sure that our application has access to the client, we need to pass in the client prop is equal to client, like this. Client is equal to the client that we created. Brilliant. This is all great. And if we head to our application, you should be able to see that, hey, it all works. It's nothing's broken, which is always a great sign. Now, let's go ahead and confirm some of this stuff worked. I'm going to click Inspect Element on here. I'm going to open up my React DevTools. This series sort of assumes that you have React DevTools set up, okay? Inside of my React DevTools here, I can sort of open things up, and I can see my Apollo provider, where I have a client, and that has children, and that's all great because we now have our application. It's up and running. We have sort of a default client, and if you open up that default client, you should see a whole bunch of stuff, okay? You can see I have client, which is a default client. I have a cache, which has nothing in it. Yeah, here's a whole bunch of stuff that we're going to get to use in a little bit here. And for the most part, you don't really need to know what's inside of this client object. You can, and there's benefits to knowing some of these things, but for the most part, we're hardly going to be looking at this prop itself. But we do now have our application connected correctly to our Graph CMS endpoint, and just like we wrote an API query here, soon we're going to be able to write an actual API query in our application and have that information output in our React application. And eventually we're going to be able to write some React components using render props to do some really cool stuff to pull out that data, write loading states, eventually get into things like mutations where you're modifying the database from a form. And we're going to get into even more amazing things like subscriptions and optimistic UI and pagination. And well, some of my favorite things about Apollo, which is Apollo link state, which is where you can actually have your application state saved in your Apollo cache. In addition to link state, you also have the abilities to link in various other libraries like persistent caching so that basically your entire cache is stored in local storage, really, really speeding up user time. So check it out. This is React and Apollo up and running using Apollo Boost and React Apollo. Could it be any easier? You got 3 lines here, and we have just one React component, and that's it. You're going to love Apollo. I mean, trust me, when I use this library, I'm constantly in love with how easy it is. So check it out. This is Apollo. In the next video, we're actually going to get to write and respond to a query from our React application here. We're going to see the data happen just like we would if we were running this from our API Explorer. So check it out in the next video as we get that going. If you want to complete this series, head on over to leveluptutorials.com/store and become a Level Up Pro, where you get access to this series as well as a ton of other series, including React 16 for everyone, Level 2 React, which goes over how render props even work. We're going to be using render props all over this site. So if you want to know how render props work, check out Level 2 React, along with all the other premium content on Level Up Tutorials. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.